The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar from the National Association of EMS Educators. I'm very excited to welcome Dustin Young and Dr. Bill Young for today's presentation on recognizing and addressing signs of mental health issues, not only in EMS students, but also in educators and providers. During today's presentation, we encourage you to ask questions through the question submission section in your GoToWebinar controls. We'll have an opportunity at the end of today's presentation to discuss the questions you submit throughout. If you're interested in receiving CEU for today's webinar, please register for this event on NEMSI's website by May 28th. There will be a link as well as contact information and resources referenced in this presentation emailed to everybody in attendance after the presentation concludes. Dustin and Bill, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us today. I know we're all really looking forward to this presentation. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to you guys for the presentation.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, everybody, depending upon what time zone you're currently residing in. My name is Bill Young. I'm an associate professor at the paramedic program in Eastern Kentucky University. We're located in Richmond. And I am with our subject matter expert today, Dustin Renee Young, who is a licensed clinical social worker for an agency in Oregon. And she is also as part of the adjunct faculty for Tillamook Community College in Tillamook, Oregon. You may have heard of their cheese. If you haven't, you ought to. It's delicious. She is going to be, for the most part, carrying the heavy load on this, as she is the subject matter expert. I will also tell you, you'll notice a similarity in the last names there. Dustin is my daughter. So I am totally unbiased in her opinion and what she is getting ready to share. So as far as conflicts and disclosures with any of the organizations or any potential products that we may be discussing, neither Dustin nor I have any conflicts in that regard. I do want to give you just kind of a word of a warning before we begin. We will be discussing not only issues of anxiety and depression, but also of suicide recognition. And so I just always feel like it's really important for people to kind of have an idea of that so that they can either prepare themselves if need be, or maybe log out if that is an area that's a little bit too tough. So the way that this came about was that NEMSI asked me. I'm a former board member of NEMSI, and I'm coming back onto the board in the fall. So NEMSI asked me about doing a presentation, not necessarily on mental health, but just a presentation for EMS Week. And immediately thoughts came to my mind of, we need to do something that addresses mental health issues of EMS educators as well as their students. And the way that we did this was I posted a poll on a number of social media sites, a Google group that is really, really active and very, very beneficial. And I asked two questions. And the two questions were similar but different. It's number one, if you're an EMS educator and you could sit down and you could talk to a mental health professional, what questions would you want answered? In the same way was, if you were an EMS student and you wanted to sit down and talk to a mental health professional, what questions would you want answered? And one of the first questions that came back as far as the survey was, what can be implemented to dispel the "we eat our young" mentality? And I have to tell you, we have a tendency to do that in not only in EMS, but also in public safety. And so a lot of that has to change. And so change often begins with a single person. And so what I want to share with you before we start and we get into the questions is a little bit of my own journey in this area, because I want to dispel, I want to eliminate, I want to remove as much as possible the mentality of, well, if you can't hack this job, then you need to get out of it and do something else. I've been involved in EMS since 1975. So yes, that makes me very old. I continue to teach. I'm not an active field provider, but I do teach on a full-time basis. 2 years ago, I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress syndrome, as it is called currently. And I will tell you, the last 2 years have been the toughest 2 years of my life. About 26 years ago, I went through renal failure and had a kidney transplant. 3 years ago this August, that kidney failed, and I went through renal failure again and had a second kidney transplant. And I will tell you, with what I have gone through with my own journey with PTSD or PTSD, has been tougher than renal failure. I was telling my wife just not long ago that if I could wave a magic wand and I had a choice of going through the emotional challenges that I've gone through for the last 2 years or go back on dialysis for the rest of my life, I'd take dialysis in a heartbeat. I'm sharing this with you because I don't want your sympathy. What I do want is that what we have to do is, particularly as EMS educators, is that we have to model the behavior that we want to see in our students. So I'm throwing that out there and saying that I suffer from mental illness. I have a problem with a mental illness disease that I'm seeking treatment for that involves both counseling as well as medication. It's not very well controlled, so it continues to be a very hard struggle. So this was one of the things that I wanted to really, really focus in on for the time that we've got together this afternoon, of why have we waited so long to address these issues? We focus so much in on the technical aspects of and nobody wants our students to be minimally competent. We want them to be the best that they can be. And unless we prepare them for what's coming down the pike for them, and depending upon how long that some of the students in your class or those of you that may be joining that are students have been in EMS, you may already be facing some of these issues. So the goal is to take the questions that we gathered from the survey, and we've got them distilled. I think I got about 35 different questions. Relax, we're not going to go through all of them. But what we are doing is I've distilled them down into about 10 questions that followed certain patterns. Again, like Nate said, I encourage you to share your questions. Our contact information will be shared at with a follow-up posting, so that if you have some questions either for myself or Dustin that you don't really want to put out to be asked publicly, please feel free to do so. So, Dustin, one of the things what I would like us to do is stress is an inherent part of life. Trust me, everybody's stress levels has just skyrocketed over the last 2 months with COVID-19. And I suspect that particularly as we're looking at reopening, if you're an EMS educator, you're dealing with, will hospitals let us back in? Will EMS agencies let us back in? And even if we can get back together on campuses, will campus or college administration let us back in? So I'm not so much focusing in on the normal stresses that we would have, but Dustin, how can we recognize when stress is getting too much from an educator perspective of either recognizing it in ourselves, and how can we approach students in an appropriate manner to talk to them about it?
Well, I think that's a big question, and let me see if I can unpack some of that. One of the biggest things is that when we look at how we are physically designed, we are really wired to have the capacity for intense bursts of stress in about 30-second amounts of time. And so obviously most of us could blow past 30 seconds of stress at a time, and especially right now as we have what's defined as a cataclysmic disaster going on, because it is a vast area of an added layer of stress that's not our typical day-to-day. One of the biggest things that if you're talking about anything, and when mental health, so I also act as a trainer for a nonprofit group called Augie's Hope. And Augie's Hope is geared to train first responders, teachers, really anyone who is going to come in contact with what you are termed as a gatekeeper. You are probably going to have contact with somebody before I do because you're on that front line. And so looking at that, teaching some of those signs, teaching some of the recognition of what's going to go on is important to notice. And we tend to look at symptoms, but also embedding that in your class. If you're going to teach a skill, just embed the mental health side to it as well. It's not adding another program. Please don't hear me when I say we need the mental health side to it, because I have watched as providers have recognized their own risk factors and stressors and been able to work through some of it. And it makes a better practitioner and a provider, as well as a better student if you are a student. One of the things that I always say, if you think about stress or responses, think about it in 3 different categories. The first being a physical interference or a warning sign, a behavioral, and then the psychological. And so there's a little bit of a difference in warning signs or things to notice. And some of those warning signs or symptoms could be the physical exhaustion with right now, I think we're kind of in a phase with current events where mental health distress is increasing. Our crisis response is quite a bit busier now. My caseload is picked up again, where initially people had said, I'll just wait it out. I'll talk to you on the other side. Now it's very much set in. And so that people are saying, I just feel exhausted and I'm not doing anything. Or I'm having headaches, getting ill, getting sick, feeling sick. Some of the somatic symptoms, those physical symptoms come into play where many times people start to notice those before the physical and the behavioral before the psychological. And so some of the behavioral you could watch for this of, are you using alcohol or drugs increased amounts, substances increased amounts, even food? Are you eating more as a comfort or as a stressor? Are people telling you, man, you're really irritable? And this is where I love having this conversation, and I will talk mental health awareness all day long, because of the fact that when you can embed this, when you can tell your students or your patients that, no, this is common, this is going to happen. You are going to have this erosion of your own if you do not take care of it, because you're exposed to trauma and you're exposed to that over and over and over again. And if there's not that awareness that the being exposed to difficult things really does wear on your mental health, then we run that risk of a belief that something's wrong with me. And if we don't talk about it, we think it's only us. And if we don't recognize it or tell our students or our colleagues that this is normal, we run that risk of losing great practitioners, burnout, compassion fatigue, secondary trauma, which can be a very, very massive problem within mental health, healthcare, and response. And so some of things get a little more into that later.
So one of the things that I heard you say that really struck a chord with me is that, and I'm going to raise my hand. You can't see me raising my hand, but I'm raising it. I'm guilty of, in many situations when we're teaching, whether we're teaching an EMT course or a paramedic course, we talk a little bit about the importance of mental health, either at the beginning or the end when we're teaching the operations section, and then we just kind of, we don't mention it anymore. So what I'm hearing you say is that we don't develop a brand new program, we don't add to the curriculum, but instead we embed bits and pieces of mental health recognition, of the signs and symptoms of when your mental health is beginning to be strained all through the program, and not just so that we can check off that we've completed the operations module.
Exactly. And within that component of, as you are teaching things, I think that you and I had this conversation a while ago of within the mental health and care world, the polyvagal theory, and looking at how that can increase a client's ability to calm just by educating them of this part of the body. And I think you had said, well, yeah, we teach on that, but how does that influence the mental health? And so those disjointed aspects of, we're both teaching something, but we're looking at it in a very different way. And so can you teach your students that this component also can be useful for their own coping, as well as they can teach their patients that, and it's going to add to your retention within your classroom.
Yeah, and in particular, you know, when we're teaching cardiology, we beat to death the action of the vagus nerve, and the vagus nerve, as Dustin's going to share with us, as far as activation of the vagus nerve, is not only good for supraventricular tachycardia, it's also what helps us to calm down when we do these different types of things that she'll share with us in just a little bit. And so it's important that we understand that not only is the vagal response geared towards cardiology, but it's also geared towards the importance of mental health. So another question that we got was, how do we do this, Dustin? How do we, and you kind of touched on this briefly here, so we probably won't have to spend a whole lot of time on this particular slide, but how do we build self-care mechanisms into the classroom curriculum so that it becomes expected? You know, when we're teaching our EMTs and our paramedics, we have certain expectations. One of my expectations is when they come in and they're coming in and they're doing a simulation scenario, okay? I don't care how good they are technically, they could hit all the important points in there. They could have given all of the medication when it was important to give it. They could have provided all the therapies, but if they don't get and use the patient's name within 60 seconds of making contact of a conscious and alert simulated patient, they fail the scenario. And so that's one of my expectations. So how do we do this? How do we build in the fact that some of the things that you can share with us, some of the things that they can do as far as self-care becomes expected rather than just some kind of weird out there stuff?
Yeah, and definitely when we talk about self-care, and ironically, I struggle greatly when I hear that word anymore, because it gets overused with things like, well, maybe you should just go take a walk or take a bubble bath. Maybe, and sometimes it feels a little woo-woo in that whole aspect. But what I'm talking about with building self-care for your students, for yourself, is very much a practice and a grit that helps you maintain that care even in the worst scenarios. And I love that concept of you have to use a name before anything else, because one, it humanizes the person. Now, again, sometimes you may not need to use that skill. Time and place is another area you're gonna have to, as an instructor, also care for your students of how to compartmentalize healthy, not unhealthy. And the best.
Before we go on, can you expand on that just a little bit, as far as you said compartmentalize healthy versus unhealthy? Now, tell me a little more about what you mean by that.
Well, and the way that I picture this, or how I've described it, is very much of firefighters have gear. They have to put it on. They have to know how it works before they walk into a fire. And I still have yet to ever see a firefighter run into a burning building in a Speedo, because they have to be geared up. And they have to be able to have that protective gear on first before that they can be effective. Otherwise, they become the victim or some other issue. But that side of how do you embed this into practice? How do you make this a routine for them? When to give you an idea, again, I'm not a medical first responder in the sense of that, but I do walk into, we have a mobile crisis team, and we all take rotations or fill in for the crisis team if needed. And when I walk up to a house or a location, the first things I have to go through in my mind are exactly that of who's this person's name. You need to slow your walk down because I might walk really fast, and the more excited and adrenaline rushed that I am, I may talk faster, walk faster, expect the client to move faster with their story. And so I have to slow myself down to almost an uncomfortable pace for me. But the whole factor of also identifying what I am doing, the neuroscience to identifying what you're doing physically is a technique that gives you a sense of power, and it lowers that stress response. And it gives you a sense also of having some control. The other components within this are teaching things like, again, I don't want a paramedic rolling up on a scene, flapping their hands, going, oh my God, I don't know what to do. That's gross. I don't want to hear that as a patient if I am in distress. I want you to act like you know what you're doing. Confidence, calm, you're going to give me the orders. And so you're going to need to compartmentalize because you may be thinking, oh my goodness, this is terrible. This is gross. However, I want you to put that away until you can decompress. And that's the part two of having and building a culture within your classroom, within your agency, within your different locations, of having a time and a place to decompress where there is not a risk. Now, when we talk decompressing, that means that I don't have my grade at risk. I don't have maybe an instructor in the room, or I don't have my boss in the room, because there's still this idea of that's going to carry over into something else. When
you're talking about decompression, can you break that out a little bit? Now, because are you talking about decompressing with another person or decompressing by yourself?
Both.
Okay.
So depending, if you think through depending, how do you metabolize stress? How do you metabolize it? What is your processing? And I use the word metabolizing because we do have to figure it out of how do we focus on that. I work in a profession, I don't really get to talk through details or information with other people. And even within my own either supervision or care, I don't always go into details about clients. And so my body physically stores a lot of that. And so seeking out things like massage or a therapist who is able to process without having all the details. You don't need all the details to process. But really finding how you process best. That's the other thing, is I can't give you a checklist of what to do. That's the difference of, you have to do some of that work, and really resiliency is hard work, and it is consistent work, and it is not a one and done. And so that side is to tell your students, this is hard work on that side too, the mental health side.
So I think you bring up a really good point in the fact that, number one, dealing with mental health is not often like dealing with a headache. You know, if we have a simple headache, we take some Tylenol, the headache goes away, we're all well and good. But in dealing with mental health, you're probably looking at things, especially if things start going sideways and it begins to affect you negatively as you progress in your career, then it's going to be something that you're going to need to deal with potentially on a daily basis. Would that be an accurate statement?
daily, sometimes moment by moment. And that's what frustrates people, is that I will talk about grounding skills. So those skills of staying in the present moment versus getting worried about future or reliving past. And they'll say, well, I tried that once. And I understand that process of, it's frustrating because it's like, am I not done with this yet? I thought I learned this already. And so it is. It's very much a process of daily, if not moment by moment, depending how severe symptoms can get.
So it's not so much the issue of the one and done. You know, you get this. You know, we hear all the time that you know, exercise is good for you, breathing is good for you. Well, I tried exercise once and I had trouble breathing, so it couldn't be good for me. Okay, and as we're going through, then what you're saying is that even if it doesn't seem like it's working, the research shows that it is effective, and you've got to keep doing it until you start seeing responses or start seeing improvement. Would that be accurate?
Yeah, and you're building a new habit, which is building neural pathways that are not there yet. So it's going to probably be frustrating. It's going to be uncomfortable. You may actually feel exhausted from it because of that fact of its new growth within your brain. And so teaching, it's just like expecting students to come into a classroom and begin to learn all of this stuff. You don't say it one time, I hope. You don't say it one time and then expect them to go take their exam. You fold it in different ways and different areas and different approaches so that there's some repetition there, that by the time they're under the stress of the exam, they can hopefully bring up some muscle memory of sorts, so to speak, of what to do and how to do it.
Okay, good. Now another question that came in, and this one came in on the portal that I used for the student, but I can tell you that every educator on here, every instructor on here faces this exact same question. When and how do I say no to more shifts? And so, Dustin, I want you to speak to that in just a little bit, as far as some of the negative ramifications from both a physical and emotional type of process of when we work ourselves into the ground. Because trust me, within the class that I've got right now, I don't think I have any students who are employed by a single agency. They're all employed by more than one. And taking it out of the student arena and putting it back into the educator part, it seems like, and I'm betting every instructor, every educator on here can commiserate with me. It seems like somebody is always adding more to our desk, much like we see with the desk on the slide here. Whether it is coming from, you know, your school's administration, whether it's coming from the accrediting agencies that accredit paramedic programs, and I'm not slamming them. I'm a site visitor for COA. I'm a firm believer in what they do. I believe that they're advancing education. Whether it's coming from the National Registry, again, disclosure here, I'm a National Registry test rep, and I support what registry does. But it seems like every time we turn around, someone is adding something to our plate. And so first of all, for educators, sometimes we're in a kind of a precarious position. If you work for a college or a university system that uses tenure, basically I call it, depending upon how long yours is, my tenure process was 6 years, and I called it a 6-year hazing process. So basically in that 6 years, you're really kind of afraid to say no to anything, simply because you don't want the potential for your tenure application to be kicked back for any particular reason. But I think one of the things that we have to do as EMS educators is that we have to understand when enough is enough. Teachers in general take the education of their students extremely seriously. And I think as an educator, at some point in time, you've got to be able to look at it, and there's no hard and fast rule. What I like to tell my students is that, let's go back to SVT for a minute. You know, it's kind of like we teach them vagal maneuvers, and we teach them adenosine, and then we teach them electrical therapy. And they say, well, which one should I use for which patient? And I go, I don't know. That's where your clinical judgment comes in. And you've got to decide which is the least invasive treatment to reach this particular type of problem. And so I think for EMS educators first, I think we have to decide at some point in time of this can wait or this is not important at all, and either move it to the side or move it into the circular file folder. Now, for students, I understand your wages for the most part are very low. And in many situations, it takes working multiple jobs in order to provide for your family, and you should provide for your family. But you also have to understand as you're beginning your EMS career that working that many jobs, running that many calls, and even if you're not in a busy agency and you think, well, I work for a busy agency, then I go over here and work for a slower agency, being away from your family, being on the clock can grind you into the ground. Now, Dustin, when a person has too much work to do and this begins to affect them psychologically, not necessarily what are some things that they can do to kind of step away from that work, but how can they understand, can they begin to recognize that this is affecting them and affecting them in a negative manner?
I think an awareness first of the boundaries that come into play. We run a risk of when it is hard for us to take a day off or get our minds off of work, those can sometimes be red flags. They can be concerning where, and I laugh because my desk looks very much like that at my main office, because within the realm of social work, your inbox is never empty. My question would be of what is the risk of saying no? And unless you're a supervisor, and I could be wrong, again, this is within my realm and my world, the supervisor's job is the one to fill that position, that opening or that scheduling challenge. You do not have to be everything to everyone. And actually a sign of compassion fatigue or kind of red flags toward burnout is actually believing that they can't do it without you. And kind of this over sense of inflation about our own abilities. And so we run that risk of having tunnel vision about what we can do and what we can't do. It really is paying attention to what boundaries, how much time are you spending with work and with home? And again, are you actually metabolizing what you're exposed to, or is it just building up and waiting for one way or another, it's going to erode at that health? And
I'm sorry, go ahead.
It could show up in that explosion, or it's going to just permeate every part of your life. Are people noticing that you're just on edge, or emotions are raw, or again, you're using substance in whatever capacity to medicate that level? And to say, no, I can do more. No, just add a little bit more. Sometimes I will tell people for the next 2 months, I've basically told myself or put myself on a no. I have to say no to everything for the next however long. Sometimes it's a couple of weeks within that time frame, or sometimes it's months, because there are things that we want to do even that are really exciting, and then it becomes stress, or it becomes more difficult to handle. And so that boundary awareness is very key. And that would be another area of balancing in there. I think as an instructor as well, one of my EMS students who takes psych from me said, I can't turn my camera on because I'm actually listening to another webinar or another class at the same time as your class, but I don't want to miss the attendance. And at that point, I just said, this is not that important. The other is a lab, and the other is a medical focus. You, as long as you stay up with your assignments, we'll work something else out. And so I like that comment that you made too, of being aware of the expectations you're placing on your students too. Check in with them. Rapport is the biggest thing an instructor can have. That social emotional currency with students is valuable, because that's going to be really what tells you, is this student at risk? Are they doing okay? That's going to tell you some of those warning signs as well.
So can you expand a little bit on that development of rapport? I mean, as EMS educators in general, we're all very, very cognizant of there are boundaries, and they're there for a good reason. And we don't want to cross them, but we don't want to come across as so cold that a student would not feel comfortable coming to them with a problem, or at least if we recognize it as a problem of overwork, of overstress, of over fill in the blank, that we would not be able to go to the student and say, hey, can we talk about this? Let's go get a cup of coffee or something.
I think so. Rapport is very much about the details. We tend to make a judgment on people much faster than even before people talk. I've heard variations of research saying within 6 seconds, we have a judgment of if we are interested in connecting with a person. Some have said 12 seconds, it varies. But again, do your students walk in or arrive to class in whatever capacity, and do you act like you're excited to see them? You don't have to be over excited, but are you welcoming? Same concept that you had mentioned of, do you use their names? Do you know who they are? Do you listen when they speak, in the sense of when they start to ask a question, do you allow them to finish it? These are all little things that we think, yeah, whatever. However, if we don't feel heard, we don't feel seen. And so then that impacts our own value within a class or within a job. And in a way, your response to them increases their kind of that reward, because oxytocin's released when we feel like we're connecting with another person. So in a way, you can manage your class stress level just in your behaviors. It's a co-regulating. The other thing is going to be being very aware of, how do you talk? Do you use trauma-informed language, in the sense of when you talk about people who may need to give UAs, do you term a UA as hot or dirty, versus using actual terminology of it as positive or negative? We don't realize.
So you're going to have to translate for us. What does a UA mean?
Urinary analysis.
Okay, all right. So a drug screen.
A drug screen, yes.
Okay.
And then, do you talk about people? So one of the things that has been a challenge when I hear the term from other professions is, well, the mentals are here. Yeah, the mentals in room 6.
Okay.
No, they're not a mental, they're a person. And the reason that you want to be aware of how you talk about it is you are going to have students within your class who have diagnosis and would fall within that category. And so simply in your sarcasm or humor, are you alienating some students from even being willing to disclose to you?
Yeah, you know, I once had a boss, a great guy that I worked for when I worked in Georgia, who said, and he was coming from an employer-employee perspective, but this would work well for us within education as well, is that he said that we all carry baggage around, and just simply because I come in and I clock into work at my EMS agency does not mean that I left the luggage out in the car. I'm going to have that with me the whole time that I'm on shift. And I think that's the exact same thing that comes into play with education, is that we have to understand that we as educators, we carry our own baggage around. I shared some of my baggage with you. I would encourage you to the point that you feel comfortable. You don't have to have a complete tell-all story, but I would also tell that you be vulnerable at some point in time with your students, so that, again, it comes back to that development of the rapport, is that they begin to see you as a person and not just as an instructor. And then the flip side of that would be that you understand that when you've got that kid sitting in the back row who's sleeping again, when you've given the greatest diabetic emergency lecture that you've ever developed, there could be some very strong reasons as to why that could be. And so getting to know a little more about your students, I think, goes a long way towards developing that rapport. And then it makes it easier for them to, first of all, come to you if they're having a problem, and then to be able to open up, and then to address the things that that are actually going on, which leads us pretty well into our next slide. So let's say that I feel like that I'm having problems, all right? And so at what point should I be looking and thinking, this is more than just burnout? You know, I took a weekend off and I still don't want to go back to work. I don't like myself. I don't like others. How do I look, or within myself? When do I determine that I need professional help? You know, if I'm having a heart attack, I want a cardiologist. If I have a diabetic emergency, I want an endocrinologist. If I'm having a mental health emergency or a mental health issue, how do I know when it's time to go to a professional?
I like that question. The biggest, or the first thing I often identify is it starting to get in the way of your life? And what that may mean is it's taking over a huge amount of your thought, the energy within your thoughts, within your brain. Or maybe family is starting to say, you know, you're not doing well, or you're not acting like you used to. Listening to those things. The other thing that I often will have people do is come in for assessments and say, I really just want to check in. I've been having a hard time. The other thing to recognize is that if you have felt kind of this emotion for more than 2 weeks, if it's been kind of this same either low grade, or you've had high anxiety or interference for more than 2 weeks of time, that's kind of an indicator that something's going on and it's not just a passing mood. Emotions tend to visit, they don't move in, which is why we want to remember if we can stay kind of in the moment and let it pass, it will pass. It might pass like a kidney stone, but that process of being able to just let it pass is a huge indicator. If that's not happening for you, if emotions are not really changing over the span of 2 weeks, check in with someone. And there's a huge variety now. One of the blessings that has come out of COVID is that insurance companies are recognizing that telehealth can be as important, if not more important, because we can reach people who may not have access to come into an office. And so there's varied approaches. Some people prefer online, some people, there's text platforms now. And so just even checking in with someone to say, is this kind of normal, or is this something I need to begin noticing and working on?
Okay, that's great. That's and the issue of telehealth, I think, is extremely important we've talked about telehealth and its role in EMS just a little bit, as far as particularly when we're working with patients. Maybe we have a patient we're not sure about, and we can actually do an audiovisual consult with a physician at the hospital. But one of the good things that has come out of this is exactly what you said, is the expansion of telehealth for both physical and mental health, because sometimes people in rural areas, they have trouble getting both the physical and the mental health that they're going to need. I mean, for a number of years, I worked in Kansas, and I greatest people in the world live in Kansas, I will tell you. And one of the things I found out was that I used to think that there was urban, suburban, and then rural, and it ended there. But no, there's another category, and it's called frontier. And a lot of people live in frontier areas, and they don't have access to the mental health that they need. They may be struggling from an EMS perspective of seeing friends and family hurt or die on a regular basis. So the telehealth issue is a really, really good route to go. And I think you're going to share a few more resources as we get towards the end on how to kind of link up within that. So let's say I've decided I need counseling, okay? And so there's this mystery behind counseling. We have the proverbial, you go into the psychiatrist's office and you lie on the couch. Well, they don't have couches anymore for the most part. But what should I expect? Okay, you talked a little bit about sometimes people come in and they are doing just a check-in assessment. But let's say that you and I have met, and I've decided, okay, I need some help. What can I expect? How long can I expect to be in counseling? Is this going to be something I'm going to have to do for the rest of my life, or what? Tell us from your side what to expect.
Okay. Well, first, let me also preface a request. One of the things that I often will hear from other community partners and whatnot are, well, go see a counselor and they can help you fix it. And I always tell clients when they come in, the first thing you're going to probably do is you have to fill out information. That's part of it. But also you're going to do an assessment. And that's kind of just getting a baseline reading of where things are, maybe some family history, some just overview. Again, working from a baseline to get to know you as well as building rapport. But one of the things is that counselors actually are not miracle workers. We don't prescribe unless we have that degree, that psychiatric focus and medical focus. But what it is that oftentimes they will assist, they'll reflect, but the client, the patient, however you frame it, they're going to be doing a lot of hard work. And if your counselor doesn't expect you to do work, I would say maybe consider a different avenue, because you take those things and again, you're building the skill set and the tools needed to take with you. What you can typically expect is an assessment, an overview, trying to get a baseline. And then there's also a varied level of approaches. So within my practice, I like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectic behavioral therapy. I use some different approaches. I work with younger kids as well. And so training in with what's called parent-child interaction therapy, which is a very directive, awesome program. I could go on about that for families. But that side of the first and foremost, again, if you do not click with your counselor, you are interviewing clinicians, not the other way around only. And so if after a few visits, you just do not feel comfortable, I always tell people, give me 4 visits and then we'll reassess it, because sometimes we don't mesh. And if you're going to be doing work, you need to be able to trust and relate well with somebody. The other would be looking for appropriate training, specialized if needed. I like what you said of there's specialties within physical care, the same within mental health. And so if you want to do what's called EMDR, that takes specialized training, extensive specialized training, and you can ask about licensure, you can ask about training. And so the other side is, if there's not progress happening, if you don't feel like there's some progress. Now, again, it's not a one and done. Sometimes it can be a lengthy process. But if you've been in the field for 30 years, that's a lot of information that's compounded along with your own life, along with your own personal struggles and trauma that happens through life. That's going to be compounded quite a bit. Now, it doesn't mean that it's a lifelong thing. There are short-term clinical approaches as well as other long-term. And so they vary. The biggest thing I would say is go in and ask questions. Ask a lot of questions.
So what I hear you saying as far as counseling goes, it's very similar to a student-teacher relationship of, if I come in and I keep referring back to cardiology because I love cardiology. The heart is just an incredible organ. But if I come in and I'm teaching students how to read an EKG, and I've got a 50-minute class with them 3 times a week, if I only spend 50 minutes with them 3 times a week, they're probably not going to learn that unless they take what we've discussed in class and study it outside of class. And then, so what I'm hearing you say then is counseling is in a similar manner of the counselor will give you strategies, will give you mechanisms of things to do to work on. And unless you do that, nothing's really going to change. So you're not necessarily going to be helped just simply by that 1-hour counseling session that you have, as much as it is, are you going to take the information that you gain from that 1-hour counseling session and do it over the next week or 2 weeks between that and your next meeting?
Yeah, exactly. It's the practice that gets it into that routine and builds those neural connections. Once a week, at 50 minutes, usually is what a clinical hour isn't really going to do much. That's kind of like eating an apple and expecting to build a 6-pack on your stomach, not in a can. Gotcha.
All right, so now I'm going to skip this slide because we're running a little bit long, but I do want to get to this one. So, and this is important to me because a couple of years ago, I had a student come into my office, sit down and start crying and say, I tried to kill myself last night. And to be quite honest, I've taught for a long time. It's kind of like, okay, now what do I say? So can you help us out here as far as if an educator has a student who does just like this student did to me, comes and discloses, or you suspect that maybe they are becoming detached and they're becoming suicidal, what are some things to look for? And what are some things that we need to do as educators to help to forestall that or to stop it?
As educators, the first thing I would say is this is where getting a little bit more training, a little more education on your own part. There are 2 programs that I really recommend, and I'll add these with resources. One is mental health first aid. I believe it's an 8-hour training. And it looks at that component of some just overviews of mental health, and it's very, very well done. The other is, it's called QPR, Question, Persuade, and Refer. And it teaches you some skills along the lines of, how do I even talk to somebody who I may be concerned with? It can be very uncomfortable for people to ask a question such as, are you thinking of killing yourself? In a comfortable manner, because again, you can ask that way, or you can say, you're not really thinking of killing yourself, are you? And one approach opens more conversation. The other approach is basically saying, I don't want to have this conversation. Your answer needs to be no. And so looking at those trainings, they're not long in extent, but they are needed, and you are what's called a gatekeeper, because exactly, your student is more likely to approach you than to seek out a mental health number, go in for an appointment, and disclose, because
Okay.
there's a relationship there.
Okay, good, good. And we're coming up on our hour, so I do want to kind of leave just a little bit of time for any questions that would have that may have come in. There are some additional resources, and there will be even more resources that will be emailed out to you. 3 that I want to share with you. One is called the Code Green campaign, and this is EMS related. And their mission from their website, they do some really good work. They've got some really good resources at their website. And reading from that, their mission is to bring awareness to the high rates of mental health issues in first responders and reduce them. And I like the second part of this, is to eliminate the stigma that prevents people from admitting these issues and asking for help. And that's really, really important. Second one is called Reboot Recovery. I will tell you, this is a faith-based organization that was originally developed for the military, for veterans coming back, and with the high rates of suicide that they had with those warriors. They also have a reboot recovery first responder type of process, and theirs is a 12-week program that specifically addresses the critical incident stress and trauma faced by those in emergency services. And this one is open for both, or for all areas of public safety, fire, EMS, and law enforcement. The nice thing, again, I'm trying to look at things as being half full, is that they now have an online version of their 12-week program, and so you can find out more information there. And the last one is the Anxiety and Depression Association of America, that has a ton of resources, can help you locate counselors in your area that you may be interested in looking at. So, Nate, what I'd like to find, do we have any questions? And I'll let you be the gatekeeper for the questions that maybe you saw a trend or anything that either myself or Dustin might be able to answer as we finish up here.
Yeah, absolutely. We had a couple great questions come in while you guys were speaking. One of them being, it was related to the slide about how and when can I say no to shifts if you feel like maybe you're being overworked. And this question was asking about how might you handle a situation where your agency is short-staffed and the option to not take a shift isn't necessarily a personal choice and that you want to avoid burnout or something, but it's more that you feel responsible for making sure that these shifts are covered.
And that's a great question, and I'll tell you what, that's a pretty valuable employee right there. And so keep in mind that as far as taking on those additional shifts, there's always a trade-off. Okay, we don't run around with the letter S for Superman, Superwoman on our chest. And the flip side of that is that at some point in time, if you don't take time for yourself and you're taking all these additional shifts, your body at one point some morning is going to wake up and say, hey, guess what? You're not working today. And you may not be working for several days or several weeks, because now you have either a mental health issue or you have a physical issue, you've developed an ulcer, or whatever. So the body has an interesting way of slowing us down. It's not quite as pleasant as us slowing down. So you don't have to take an entire week off away from taking additional shifts, but just to understand that at some point in time, it's a decision you'll make, or it's a decision your body will make. And I promise you, it'll be much more pleasant when you make the decision.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that answer. Our next question is sort of similar, but it's a little bit slightly transition to, do you think that a transition from 8-hour shifts to much longer work days, like 12 to 24-hour shifts nonstop, do you think that that extended work period has had an influence on burnout and quality of care?
Oh, absolutely. 24-hour shifts should be outlawed. There should not be, and and I understand you got to cover the hours, but 24-hour shifts are ridiculous as far as mental and physical health. 12-hour shifts, nursing has shown that 12-hour shifts are doable if you're not doing 7 of them in a row for weeks after a time. So, and once again, it kind of comes back to what I said earlier as far as understanding that there is a payoff for everything we do. You may be working at a busy agency and then going and working another 24-hour shift at a slow agency and thinking, hey, I can rest, I'll sleep, I'll catch up. Well, maybe you can and maybe you won't. And after a while, that will begin to take an impact on you. So I am a firm believer that 24-hour shifts are no good and should be converted to either 12s or 8s. And I think we may have time to take one more question.
Yeah, we have one final question, but it should be pretty quick to address. They're just curious if you could repeat, Dustin, that mental health training course that you mentioned, and I will send out an email with links to all of these resources, but if you could just say it again real quick.
Sure. It's mental health first aid. And then QPR. It's question, persuade, and refer.
Awesome, thanks. And I said that
both are provided by people who are certified trainers. So that is a program that you can connect with trainers as well.
Great. Thank you, Dustin. I really appreciate everything that you guys, both of you, have been able to share with us. This has been extremely valuable. I think we have addressed everybody's questions, but if anyone has anything else that you want to say or that you would like to talk personally with Bill or Dustin about, I will include information and how you can contact both of them after this presentation, so please feel free to reach out. I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to say real quick before we go ahead and sign off. But
basically, just take care of yourself physically, emotionally, spiritually, and wash your hands.
Perfect. Well, thanks
everybody.
Thank you both for being here. I really appreciate everyone tuning in and you guys for sharing this awesome information with us. You will receive a follow-up email with resources, and the recording will be posted online for everybody to view afterwards. So thanks for being here, everyone. Take it easy. Have a great day.